You talked about people feeling disenfranchised and betrayed by the system and by the elites. And that's the kind of people that supposedly voted for Trump. And your message is recurring in your writing of, you know, coming together and focusing on helping each other. I feel like when you say that, I always think of the people that voted for Trump, you know, the lower class, you know, poor, uneducated, whatever, you know, there's that sector of the population is, and I'm not sure I'm saying it correctly, but what can we do to bring the power of those people so they feel like they're part of us, like we're all together trying to struggle in this world against the big forces of capitalism and you know,
well, we have to organize around specific issues that make their lives better. $15 minimum wage, universal health care. As Saul Alinsky said, there are no permanent allies, there's only permanent power. And that means reaching out to people whose political views we find distasteful and even repugnant. But as Rosa Luxemburg understood, conversion takes place through acts of empathy that are carried out to people who are not your natural allies. And when you organize around those concrete issues, that is the starting point for political consciousness and political awakening. And one of the things that does disturb me is the kind of dismissive tone towards that disenfranchised white working class. I don't defend what the flag-waving Confederates do in the streets of Charlottesville or anywhere else, but they are also victims. And I would all encourage you to go back and read the great book, Brother to a Dragonfly, by Will Campbell, who had been the Baptist minister who, and in fact, that picture of walking the girls to school in Little Rock for desegregation, he's right next to them in the South, but became the chaplain to the Ku Klux Klan, in a sense that the state seeks to keep us polarized and divided. And we're not going to gain traction by speaking to them about their mythological past, and because they've retreated into the world of magical thinking like the Christian right. We're going to begin to break down that ideology by concretely addressing those forces that create that despair.
Hi, Chris. My name's Ted Hartman. I'm from this area. And I think anyone from this area would tell you that, certainly on a local level, the Democratic Party has a very strong hold over Albany, Troy, Schenectady. There's been machine politics in this area for decades. And my question to you is, I think like you, I think we'll all agree that the corporate powers have taken over the Republican and Democratic parties. However, it seems to me that like a far-right white nationalist element has taken over the Republican Party. Do you think it's even worth our effort or time to try to insert socialists into the Democratic Party and to try to take over that party, because they do have the mechanisms of power? Even if they're not expressing our views, is it worth our time and effort to try to insert ourselves into and hijack sort of their power mechanisms, because they've got voter rolls, they've got organization. I don't think all of the people that voted Republican last time were people who are necessarily white nationalists, but they voted for people who are white nationalists. And so is it possible for us to take over the Democratic Party, insert socialists, and then use their mechanisms of power to try to enact what we want to go?
No. The Democratic Party is a creation of Wall Street. Those who are in power, Pelosi, Schumer, are creatures of that system. They know that if they were, for instance, to institute true campaign finance reform, they'd be out of a job. And we are watching the purges now within the DNC of the Bernie Sanders supporters because they would rather go down than create an open system which would knock them off their perches or their platforms of power. Politics is a game of fear. I mean, the last liberal president we had was Richard Nixon. Not because he was a liberal or had any integrity or a heart, but because he was frightened of movements. And we have to rebuild those movements. That's our goal. And we have to hold fast to moral imperatives and not allow the establishment, including the Democratic Party, to buy us off. So you had the beginnings of a very widespread anti-war movement at the inception of the Iraq War, and what happened in 2004, they went into hiatus to elect John Kerry, who assured us that he wouldn't have pulled out of Fallujah. And this is a big mistake. You know, there's that great scene in Kissinger's memoirs, Don't Buy the Book, where Nixon and Kissinger are looking out the window. I think it's 71 or something. There's a huge anti-war demonstration, and the White House has put empty city buses in a ring around the White House to protect themselves. And Nixon's wringing his hand and says, "Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that's where we want people in power to be.
Hi, Chris. Dan Lander here. I'm curious and was very interested in kind of the utility of the word resistance that you were using through this. And my question is, so if resistance is such a fundamental kind of experience as a human, does it kind of presuppose that there will always be something to resist against, which is equally as fundamental to our experience?
Yes. I mean, there's that great passage in Vasily Grossman's magnificent work, Life and Fate, one of the probably the greatest work of fiction of the 20th century out of Russia, where he talks about the power of human kindness. It's called Life and Fate. You all have to do is put in Vasily Grossman, Life and Fate, Chris Hedges, and you'll get it. But I think that, yes, I come out of Calvin. I have a very dark view. I was a war correspondent. I have a very dark view of human nature. I think evil will always be there. And it is an eternal battle on our part to resist. And, you know, I tell the story of, since I'm close to Schoharie, of my dad, who was a Presbyterian minister in Schoharie, all white, as you know, farm community. He was very outspoken about the civil rights, supporting the civil rights movement. This was a time when Martin Luther King was probably one of the most hated men in America in rural white enclaves like Schoharie County. He had been a sergeant in North Africa in World War II, but he came back from the war a pacifist and was very active in opposing the Vietnam War and the issue for which he got pushed out of the church. He was very outspoken about gay rights. His youngest brother was gay, my uncle, and my father understood the pain of being a gay man in the 50s and 60s. And that, I was 8, 9. Very important time for me because he taught me that you're not rewarded for positions of virtue. In fact, you're usually punished for them. And what finally pushed the institutional church over the edge was his outspokenness about gay rights. And at the time, I was an undergraduate at Colgate. And my father, by the way, there was no gay GBLT organization at Colgate, so my dad actually brought the gay speakers down to the campus to have meetings with students, of which I would join. And finally, and he kept saying that you have to build a public organization, and finally, because they were too frightened to come out of the closet, he came down one day and took me out to lunch and told me that even though I wasn't gay, I had to found the GBLT Alliance at Colgate, which I did. It met and I would go into the dining hall at breakfast, lunch, or dinner. The guy would check off the my card, hand it back, and go, faggot. So when the church told him to stop, he responded by holding an Easter service for the GBLT community at that time in the city of Syracuse, where he had a church. And he said, marriage is a sacrament. It is not a reward for being a heterosexual. And any church that refuses to honor the sacrament of marriage does not deserve to call itself Christian. And he was out. Years later, after being the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, I was publicly denouncing Bush's call to invade Iraq. I was booed off of a commencement stage, lynched by right-wing media, called into the New York Times and given a formal written reprimand and told I was no longer allowed to speak about the war in Iraq. And I realized, and I'd been there 15 years, it wasn't an easy moment. No one wants to lose their job. But I realized at that moment that I could muzzle myself in service to my career. But to do so would be to betray my dad. And I quit. And when I walked out the door of that building, for the first time in my life, I articulated what it was my father had given me. And that was freedom. I didn't need the New York Times to tell me who I was. I knew who I was. I was my father's son. And in the Christian faith, we call that resurrection. And that is the power of resistance, which perhaps even my father didn't see. And it will always be there, and those acts of resistance are what Father Daniel Berrigan told me when he defined faith as the good the belief that the good draws to it the good, even if all the empirical evidence around us says otherwise. The Buddhists call it karma. But I've seen rebellion, Eastern Europe. I was speaking at dinner about watching the Velvet Revolution. I was every night in the Magic Lantern Theater with Václav Havel and Dinsbeer and all the people who would inherit the government. And the walls of Prague that winter were filled with posters of the Charles University student Jan Palach, who, to protest the Soviet invasion in 1968, had gone to Wenceslas Square and lit himself on fire and died 4 days later from his burns. His funeral, which was a non-event, was never covered by the state media, was broken up by the police. When his grave became a shrine, his body was exhumed, cremated, his ashes were given to his mother, and she was told she was not allowed to rebury them. And 2 weeks after the communist government fell, 10,000 people marched to Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. I was in Wenceslas Square when Marta Kubashova, the great singer who had sung the anthem of defiance, a prayer for Marta that was broadcast out over the airwaves in 1968. And after the imposition of the Soviet-backed government, her recording stock was destroyed. She spent the intervening years working on an assembly line in a toy factory. She was banned from the airwaves. There were 500,000 people in Wenceslas Square that night. It was snowing when she walked out on that balcony and began to sing the prayer for Marta, and every Czech in that crowd knew every word. That is the power of resistance, the moral power of resistance. That even for all those people you think are asleep, somewhere, hear it. It's from Vasily Grossman, and it's from his book Life and Fate. He was probably the premier war correspondent in the Soviet Union. You read any account of Stalingrad because he was in the front lines. they're going to be quoting Grossman. And at the end of the war, he carried War and Peace with him. He went all the way from Stalingrad to Berlin. And he came to the belief that any form of totalitarianism, any form of utopian belief, whether it's communism or fascism, is evil. And he waited until Stalin died, attempted to publish the novel. It wasn't palatable. It was seized. He became a non-person. He died, I think, in '64. And then it was until 1980, the manuscript was smuggled out and published in Europe. And I think it's one of the finest books of the 20th century. And this is the quote from him. "My faith has been tempered in hell. My faith has emerged from the flames of the crematoria, from the concrete of the gas chamber. I have seen that it is not man who is impotent in the struggle against evil, but the power of evil that is impotent in the struggle against man. The powerlessness of kindness, of senseless kindness, is the secret of its immortality. It can never be conquered. The more stupid, the more senseless, the more helpless it may seem, the vaster it is. Evil is impotent before it. The prophets, religious leaders, reformers, social and political leaders are impotent before it. This dumb, blind love is man's meaning. Human history is not the battle of good struggling to overcome evil. It is a battle fought by a great evil, struggling to crush a small kernel of human kindness. But if what is human in human beings has not been destroyed even now, then evil will never conquer."